region in South America with photographer João Pina. Thank you, João, for being here with us today. And for those of you joining us on live stream, please submit any questions or comments via the YouTube chat section. Kindly note, closed captioning for the live stream video will be provided in the coming days. And now, Latin American Studies graduate student Fabian Archie will introduce our speaker. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute honor to introduce today's speaker, João Pina. Born in Portugal, João has spent his career shedding light on human rights abuses and political turmoil across Latin America. A graduate of the International Center of Photography and Documentary Photography in New York. He's the author of 4 stunning monographs, including Livre, pensamento, featuring 25 former Portuguese political prisoners, Condor, a tune documentation of South America's dirty war, 46750, about endemic violence in the city of Rio de Janeiro, and Tarrafal, a deeply personal exploration of his family history, and a Portuguese concentration camp in Cape Verde. His work is more than photography. It's a call to remember, to resist, and to act. So please join me in welcoming João.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'm not sure if people have seen it. It's a privilege to be here and to be speaking to everybody. I think there's still some seats if you want to come in. For folks who, I'm curious, and I always ask this question in advance, who before knowing about this lecture knew about the existence of Operation Condor? Quite a few people. Who from here is from Latin America or the Southern country? So half of the ones who knew about it. That's wonderful, because I oftentimes ask this question to any audience, including in Latin America, and most people do not know about it. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself before I go into the slides, and I'm going to make a statement here that my goal in all of these academic settings, or let me ask another question. Who here thinks that academics are good at dealing with visuals? What a great surprise, isn't it? All of this to say that being a photographer and sitting in your shoes for a very long time, to me, it's always like very painful to watch their presentations where people use images just to make a point about what they're trying to say. And what I'm going to try to do here today is to invert that. So when I'll show images is for us to think about those images and to think about those images together. So I don't want to create a monologue. I know this is a lecture and I'll speak for a little bit, but I'm really more interested in creating a dialogue. So I'll talk about Condor, I'll talk about how I landed into it, but I'm much more interested in understanding how you see things and how you see things from these countries' perspective in 2025. I don't think there's much needed to be said about it, right? So let me start by introducing myself a little bit more than the biography. I'm Portuguese, and quite a few people in this room butcher my name every day, and I'm used to it. I'm absolutely fine. I was born in a country that lived 48 years of dictatorship. And the fact is, I was the first generation born in democracy in my country, with a sort of heavy and also very interesting heritage. my maternal grandparents spent together about 25 years in prison for political reasons. And so as I was growing up, as I was in school, it was very interesting because I had those stories from home. I remember from a very young age the words from my grandmother explaining to a 3, 4, 5-year-old kid, myself and my siblings, what sleep deprivation torture was, and how my grandfather had spent 15 days in sleep deprivation torture. What the statue was, the types of torture she had been going, why she couldn't hear from 1 year. All of those small things, always said in a very candid and open way, but to a 5-year-old, to a 6-year-old, in the case of my brother, 2 years older than me, it was deeply impactful, but was also an adventure. And it was like the fact that my grandfather, who I've never met because he passed before I was born, escaped twice prison, for example, was a huge sense of pride. So, interestingly enough, when I sat in those history classes and I read through the textbooks, and no mention of the Portuguese fascist dictatorship, what existed, or if it existed, was like a couple of paragraphs that we would spend not even one class speaking about it. And we would spend, guess what, 3 or 4 months speaking about the great discoveries that Portugal has done. By the way, not really addressing slavery. So that from a very young age got me the sense of history and the sense that history is told by the winners. And that's something that I'm today still very, very interested in. Not because I'm going to rewrite history, not at all. I'm not a historian. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not any of that, but I am someone who works with photography and through images tries to tell stories. So basically, that was the backdrop for my first book, Livre, pensamento, who was an idea that I had very, very young. I was about 20 years old, and all that generation from my grandparents was starting to pass. And I knew their stories because I grew up with them. My father was a member of the Portuguese Communist Party until 1991. A lot of the people that I grew up with were inside of the party. And I knew that Dias Lourenço had escaped prison, jumping to the ocean on December 9th and swimming to the shore, things like that. The problem was there was no connection between those stories that I knew and the history that was being said in school, in high school, in the universities. So that's what I'm like, I need to do something. So my first book is a reaction to that knowledge. But as I was trying to finish it, and if you ever make the very wrong decision in your life to do books, you'll understand what I'm saying. After having been screwed by my one publisher that was supposed to publish my book and never did, and having to rethink the whole thing, I had a couple of years to sort of like think this through. So what I did was I kept my research, I kept being interested in this type of stories, and I was very fortunate to come to New York, where I live again now, to study, and showing that work around in school and getting direct reactions from people I really, really deeply admire and saying, well, we've never seen like approaching history through visuals. You should think about doing this through other areas, to go to South Africa, and I was already very, very attached to Latin America, which is a place that I've been traveling to since 1987. And to me, it was very clear that where I wanted to work was in Latin America. The place that I feel at home is in Latin America. And I just decided, well, let me try to do this in Latin America. I knew the history of so many dictatorships that existed, and some of them still exist in Latin America. And I started by just simply thinking and reading, which is what I do. And these days, very hardly, because we're also distracted by the screen. But that gave me this idea of going into the history, going into what already happened. And now you're probably thinking, how the fuck do you take pictures of something that happened 40 years ago?
That's
So that's what I sort of became known for. Therefore, I made the title of this lecture Visualizing History, which is also a class that I teach. And what I did when I was reading about Operation Condor in 2004, 2005, and about this massive archive that exists in Paraguay, and about how the CIA was deeply involved and the State Department was deeply involved, and the infamous Nobel Peace Prize winner Henry Kissinger was deeply involved. So reading through all this, living in New York was just like mind-blowing to me. And it was around this time of the year where like temperatures are really, really freezing and I felt miserable. And I'm like, I just need to go. I need to go to Latin America. So reading about Operation Condor really gave me this idea that I needed to go back. I needed to start like a deep study about. And if you understand anything about photojournalism or how it used to be, the ways that one would sponsor such project, you would write what we call a pitch. So you would write a story idea, you would deliver it to a magazine like National Geographic, for example, and you would expect them to approve it, to give you an assignment. And I thought, well, Geographic is going to give me an assignment, 6 months. I can do all my research beforehand. I'll go there and I'll spend 6 months, 1 month per country photographing. The bad news is that that assignment never arrived. The good news is also that that assignment never arrived. The bad news because my bank account really suffered from not having an assignment, but because I didn't have a deadline, I was able to work on this for a very long time. So throughout 9 years, instead of 6 months, I started working on Operation Condor, started studying what Operation Condor was. And it was truly, and it has been the privilege of my life to have time to work. So what I have done initially, and this is why I haven't really started showing the images, is that I started going to Brazil and then to Bolivia and then to Argentina and studying the history, the individual history of each of these dictatorships. Because I wanted to understand in what sense. I had read, of course, that Operation Condor had been formed in 1975. There was a meeting in Santiago de Chile organized by General Contreras, who was the right-wing man for repression from Augusto Pinochet. But this is all very vague. And how do you start visualizing? How do you start making images from that? So what I did was, first I went to Brazil. I spent a couple of months trying to understand what the Brazilian dictatorship had, the specificities of it, how come it was similar or different to the others. Then I went to Bolivia, then I went to Argentina, then I went to Chile. And by studying this and speaking to people and starting to understand, I create what I call the central axis of my work. And that central axis is basically the survivors of Operation Condor, the families of the disappeared, and the places of torture and disappearance. So this image, for example, is Maria Santucho. And is anyone from Argentina here? You know the name of the Santucho family, yes. Right? It's like saying Obama in this country. The Santuchos, especially if you're from the 1970s or you have conscious from that time, they were the leader, Mario Roberto Santucho, also known as Roby. He was the leader of the Ejército Revolucionario del Pueblo, one of the armed guerrillas against the military. Because of Roby, 11 members of the Santucho family are still disappeared today. Because simply they have the name Santucho attached to them. That would be enough to be abducted, to be tortured, to be killed, and the body men disappeared. Maria's a daughter of Oscar Santuccio and the niece of Rovi, and she was abducted, tortured, and kept in a concentration camp at the age of 14 with her younger sister and with her mom. And after a few months and a lot of negotiation, she was sent, they were released under the condition they would go into exile. And oftentimes we think about repression, we think about dictatorships, and we forget about the exile. The fact that hundreds of thousands of South Americans went to exile meant that their lives changed forever. In the case of Maria, she went to Cuba. And
I thought.
and the thing is, after the dictatorship ended in Argentina, she even tried to go back, but her life was not the same. Her dad was missing, she could not adapt, and her life had already been built in Cuba. So basically, she kept going and she lived in Cuba, now lives mostly in Argentina, but now Maria is close to 70. So her life was completely changed. Her mother passed away in Cuba. Every aspect of your life was radically changed. So that's one of the issues, exile. Another of the issues is the locations. So this is Punta Rieles, in the outskirts of Montevideo. Was a prison, a women's prisoner. I think everybody knows who Pepe Mujica is.
Yes.
The former president of Uruguay, one of the left-wing heroes of Latin America. His wife was actually imprisoned in this prison. And Pepe, when he was the president of Uruguay, there was the need of space for prison space, and Punta Rieles had been shut down after the dictatorship, and he decided to reopen it, not as a memorial, but as a prison. So it's also the fact that these spaces have been abandoned, appropriated, repurposed, and sometimes became prisons again. So I was there with Anaït Aronian. Anaït is the daughter of survivors of the Armenian genocide who exiled in Uruguay. And she grew up in the Armenian community in Montevideo. And she became also involved in politics in the early 70s, eventually joining the Tupamaros, another armed wing against the repression of the regimes. And one day, already full-on dictatorship installed, her doors knocked down in the middle of the night. She was living underground. And the guy, the front man of the operation, was a military man, an Uruguayan military man who had been Anaït's childhood friend, also an Armenian. So here are two people fleeing the genocide in Armenia, growing up in Uruguay, La Suiza, Las Americas, and yet being in opposite sides of the barricades. And this man, actually, Anaït tried to trick him, like, what are you doing here? She had a different name, and she tried to trick him so she wouldn't be identified, but he was clearly after her, and he was her torturer. So her childhood friend became her torturer. I'm not going to do this for every single image, but what I'm doing is I'm giving you the prompt to read this image, and which is very different from like using these photographs just to make a point. And this is one of the photographs that I mostly like, because I call it a psychological photograph. What do you see in this? Anyone? What is the vibe that you get from this image?
Wasted furniture.
Sorry?
Wasted furniture.
Furniture?
The door.
The door. What, do you get any feelings from that door?
There's a couple of hands, right? So
Please.
there's like a lot of shadow, and we also have spaces that have light, but it's still in contact with the shadow.
But you're deconstructing the image.
Where is the mirror? Is this a mirror?
No.
Like-
But what is the sensation that you get from that?
A sheltered space with a lot of darkness in it and a lot of crumbling stuff around, basically.
Yeah. So I think that's about right. So this is when, how do you photograph something that is no longer here? That's how I responded to that. So this is Londres 38, London 38. It was a house, it is a house in downtown Santiago in Chile, which back when Pinochet left, nobody really knew where it was, but everybody knew there was a clandestine detention center in the downtown area of Santiago. And the few survivors from that place, they had been brought in blindfolded. If you have ever been blindfolded in your life, you know there's a little bit of space that your nose creates that allows you to see a tiny, tiny bit of the floors. So the few survivors of this place always mentioned that they had been brought to a space with a wooden door, with black and white tiles on the floor. And then at the end of that entrance, there was a staircase that would bring them up to the torture room. And when the dictatorship fell in Chile and when the human rights groups were very active of trying to rebuild the map, they really went like door by door to try to find these locations. Till one day they knock at the door of one location, a wooden door, with black and white tiles on the floor, and there's staircase in the very end of it that was brought up to what was the second floor of the house. And that is number 38 of the street of London, Calle Londres, número 38. I was there because this was much, much later. This is in 2009. And someone who works in that place, who used to be a police station, mentioned this story. So to me, it was very obvious. This is one of my photographs. I need to go back to the entrance and look at that floor. Look at those little tips that are able to help me to put together this sort of like visual puzzle, let's put it that way. So I did. I basically went back to the entrance and spent a few minutes just like composing that. But then it's that, it was that shadow and light and the black and white and all that symmetry there that made that psychological picture something that I think makes me as a viewer think. And this is why one of those images that I call the psychological images, that's what creates a landscape. And it's very different if I had started with this image than with the image that I decided to start, which was also another torture chamber in Argentina. But the way you sequence these images is also key. This is another story, and it's in Brazil, in the north of Brazil, in the Amazon region, in the Araguaia River region, where there used to be a guerrilla, and the dictatorship managed to basically, after 3 major military operations, they brought down the guerrilla. The problem with that is that not only they captured and killed the guerrilla members, but they disappeared the bodies. And they have been condemned by the Inter-American Court for Human Rights to investigate their own crimes, the Brazilian state crimes that they have committed years ago, because there has been no investigation in Brazil about this. And I was fortunate enough, after much, much insistence, to be able to follow parts of that work. And this is the moment where, after exhuming a body, the special group that is working on this, which is a joint task force of the Ministry of Human Rights, Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Defense. So it's the military investigating what the military did. Guess what? There hasn't been much result of these investigations after this group, for obvious reasons as well. And all of this to say, I kept going around these territories, photographing these spaces, photographing these locations, working together with ELEAP, el Equipo Argentino de Antropología Forense, who are some of the most incredible people that I've seen that over the last 40 years have worked not only in Argentina, but all throughout the world, with like deep science and deep technology to identify the remains of people who are disappeared. And this is the storage room, one of their main house in Buenos Aires, where skeletons from the 1980s are still stored, waiting for an identification. So what I was doing is basically bringing all the pieces of this puzzle together, photographing objects that had been exhumed from mass graves, really trying to document all of the aspects of these stories. Starting from the individuals, as I mentioned, the families that disappeared, the survivors of disappearance, the spaces of disappearance. This is Automotores Orleti, a former garage that was the headquarters of Operation Condor in Argentina. So where all the foreigners were being brought, and from where most of the disappeared that are foreigners in Argentina were disappeared from, including Cubans, Chileans, Uruguayans, etc. But I was also deeply interested in the landscapes. As I mentioned, out of my youth and arrogance, I started doing a project in Portugal. And if you know a little bit of the history of Portugal, you know that we are actually quite megalomaniacs, right? And like, we are from a small country, but we sailed throughout the world. And I sort of like appropriated myself with that heritage. Like, if I could do a story about Portugal and military and political repression, I can do this throughout South America, right? Like, super simple, but not. What was very interesting to me was the landscape. So this is the Amazon. One thing, this happened in the Amazon, in Patagonia, in La Cordillera, in the desert. So those landscapes kept coming to me. And there was also a way to inform the viewers, the readers, the people who go to the museums where these facts had happened. So I made sure of like try to collect as much pieces as I could to bring the viewer the stories, the backstories, the images. And then obviously, and that's why I made the book to circulate, obviously I had to contextualize all of this. So I had to write for these stories. And in the book, I made sure to use certain tricks in order to make it still visually appealing, etc. But this is Jonas, also known as Josias, what's his war name, one of the very few survivors of the Araguaia guerrillas, still living today pretty much underground in the Araguaia region, because you never know. And that never know pens through your head for the rest of your life. And it took me a few days to find him with some people who knew him well. But he decided to speak and he decided to pose for my camera. It was very interesting. Also, the families of the disappeared in the Atacama Desert. Vique Saavedra and Victoria and Violeta, the two older women on the right of the frame. If you haven't seen, I really recommend you see this amazing documentary film called Nostalgia de la Luz, Nostalgia for the Light by Patricio Guzman. They are part of that film, but I had been introduced to them, and they are the sister and the lover of two different men who were disappeared by Pinochet, and the others are younger family members from other disappeared people that are still disappeared to these days, because simply after the coup and Pinochet decided to arrest thousands of people, how he dealt with it, it was basically after he sent the Caravana de la Muerte to go throughout the country, emptying the prisons, that squad shooting them, executing them, and opening mass graves and putting the bodies there and never telling the families where they were. The worst part of this is not even that the Caravana de la Muerte existed, is that in the late 80s, already like 15 years after this, because the dictatorship was coming to an end and Pinochet knew it, what he created was Operación Retiro de Televisores, where he sent military men to go back to these places to empty these mass graves and to put the remains in helicopters and airplanes to fly over the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and get rid of the evidence. So these women who have been literally walking through the Atacama Desert for decades are walking, always looking at the floor, trying to find a small piece of evidence. It could be a small piece of bone, something that helps them to dig and to hopefully find more remains that will help them to identify bodies. Vic she's the lady with the white hair in the center. Her brother was identified in the mid-1980s because when they removed the remains, obviously the body is long ago decomposed, and some pieces of the body are left behind. So they found a boot with a feet inside of the boot, and that actually was her brother's boot and feet. So she kept the foot for a couple of months in her house in order to say goodbye to her brother, and finally she was able to bury and to cope with that. So that is very interesting, and that's why, to me, it's key to speak about the eternal pain of the disappearance. If you read Antigone, you know that all of that is basically the right to bury your dead, the right to have a place to go and mourn your loss, right? When you remove that right from the families, you're basically perpetuating the torture that not only these men and women have gone through, but you're also imposing those families to never cope with those deaths. And the military dictatorships knew this very, very well. I'm sure all of them had read Antigone, and that was their way of punishing and permanently punishing these families. This is actually an amazing scene that happened in 2007 in the Argentine side of Patagonia, in Trelew, where Horacio Bau had been disappeared for 40 years, since 1977. He was returned for 30 years, I'm sorry. He was returned to his family, and they finally could have a proper burial. And it was the only burial that I've seen until today where people in the end were actually clapping and cheering because that family finally had a place to go and prize Mario's loss. So it was very interesting. But then obviously I kept going into these locations. I kept photographing the remains of these spaces, the torture rooms, the histories behind it, until I landed in another of my psychological, but this is more absurd than psychological. This is an Electra airplane that was used in Argentina to transport people from concentration camps, and they were going to be transported into a different location. This was the official version that we're telling the prisoners. And in order to prepare them for that transportation, they would give them a tranquilizer. They would load them into an airplane. And as soon as that airplane left Buenos Aires, he would make a curve onto the La Plata River and the Atlantic Ocean. They would open their doors and they would dump the prisoners alive into the river and into the ocean. This became known as los vuelos de la muerte, the death flights. And journalists can be a pain in the ass, and I know this. And thanks to a journalist who I deeply admire, Diego Martinez, who took years of investigation to find out which airplanes had been used to that, to go and see those airplanes' logbooks and identify exactly on which day those flights, which were training flights, were being made. He was able to identify what happened to those airplanes as well. So this one in particular was 1 out of 3 that he was able to identify and track it to being used during the Falkland Wars to transport military troops onto the conflict. And later in the, I believe, 1990s, was sold in an auction as chatarra, as junkyard. And the owner of this store, which sells construction materials, because the airplane had been used in the Falkland Wars and he felt like a patriot, he bought this piece of junk to put on top of his store, painted it with the Argentine flag colors, and it was a very easy advertising. If you wanted to buy something from his stores, like, where's your store? It's an industrial area. Well, mine is the one with the airplane on top. After Diego found this airplane in this location and wrote his story, the judge that was actually investigating investigating the death flights, called that a key piece of evidence. So the poor guy from that shop can no longer take a screw out of the airplane because now that's evidence and it's protected by the law. So it was very interesting to see how these objects that remain circulating somehow now are, sometimes they're part of evidence, other times they're completely ignored, but they still exist. And again, it's another piece of that puzzle. this is what the La Plata River, which is, as some of you know, very, very wide. So it was very easy to dump bodies into it. Some of them came ashore, but most of them are completely disappeared until today. So I kept going and photographing people, photographing the victims, civilian victims of these conflicts as well, like this man, Lauro, who, without knowing, grabbed a hand grenade that had been left behind by the Brazilian military in the Amazon as a booby trap. And he grabbed it. He didn't know what it was. He was walking in the middle of the forest. He triggered it. He left it. He lost his arm and he killed his brother because of a booby trap left by the army. So these locations are, some of them or a lot of them have been destroyed exactly to get rid of evidence, but now they're part of archaeological sites. So forensic archaeology. The survivors are coping with their own traumas and trying to find out how to create a life after all of this. This is Elsa Ramirez, who for over 30 years never played her beloved instrument, the harp, because she had been arrested. When she got arrested, she was living underground in Paraguay, and the harp was her passion, but she couldn't play because it was very hard to play. If you're living underground, it's very easy to identify someone's playing the harp, right? So like she, after her prison experience in the concentration camp where she stayed, emboscada here, she never touched the harp again. And when we met, she had recently, only 3 months before, started to play the harp again. And to me, that was a very interesting story of like how you're able to face your own issues of the past and keep building and keep creating from it, which is fascinating. Mirta was sort of like my Argentine mother. We had a very, very heated discussions about politics, and she was also a member of the Montoneros, and she was sent to prison, not to concentration camps. She was a legal political prisoner. Her son was born in prison, and there's a lot of trauma that live into that. And Mirta Clara unfortunately passed away from cancer a few years ago, but she was a very, very, very strong woman, and she wouldn't take any bullshit from anyone. And that's the type of woman that I really admire. And so as I was doing this portrait, I was also doing images like this, which are the friends and families of the former military man in Argentina that are now being accused for crimes against humanity. And they're protesting. They're protesting in one of Buenos Aires' main squares and protesting for what they call our political prison. And the funny thing is that 40 years before this picture was made, the simple act of protesting in the city of Buenos Aires would be enough for you to be arrested, tortured, and disappear. And here are they, rightfully so, doing their protest, nobody messing up with them. And they're all the body language, as you see, is very military and very interesting. And this was right around the time that I was photographing youth as well. But then I was super interested, and I'm going to wrap up with this, super interested in what Argentina did, and somehow is still doing much slower now, especially with the ongoing presidency in Argentina, which is the trials for crimes against humanity. If you know anything about international law, you know that crimes against humanity, which are very clearly typified, do not expire. So that's one of the reasons why sometimes we hear in the news like, well, there's a Nazi officer from the SS that was finally found in trial 80 years after the war. There was a law in Argentina, actually 2 laws in Argentina up until 2004 that prevented crimes against humanity to be investigated in Argentina. Those were punto final y obediencia debida. Those are the 2 names of the laws that then President Nestor Kirchner abolished, and it paved the ground for the trials against humanity to be done in Argentina, which for my lifetime, it's one of the most extraordinary things I've ever met. This is like watching the Nuremberg trials happening live in front of you. If you go to Buenos Aires, you can actually go into the sessions and sit down and assist these things that are happening. And initially, the biggest problem was for photographers to have access, because the judges were very protective and they didn't want press around, but these trials were public. So the Supreme Court eventually ruled that because they were public and they were being filmed, the press would also have to have access. So oftentimes they would give us a few minutes just before the session started to be inside and photograph. If you understand anything about photography and you see the square format, I'm working with a medium format camera. Medium format cameras, for most of you here, are very young. Probably your grandparents have one of those cameras that you look from the top. Those are medium format cameras. The negatives are larger, the optical quality is amazing, but there's a problem. They're much slower to work with than a typical photo camera, and now phone. So I needed more time to set up. And when you have a prison guard saying, okay, you need to move, you need to move, you need to move, and I haven't been able even to focus, that was deeply stressful. But then I made a few pictures and I found my ways into some of the trials, which actually very important, like this one in Bahia Blanca, where these men were being trialed, and because it was not in the capital, and because the press had covered only the few first months of these trials, I could actually go in and spend some time, and the judge would give me authorization. So I was able not only to spend time inside, but they were also giving me access to when the prisoners were being brought in and brought out, and I could be close by and photograph. So I did. As I did go into the Campo de Mayo, where the last dictator of Argentina was being tried and sentenced for 30 years in prison for crimes against humanity, including abducting children, forcibly disappearing people, rape, etc., etc., etc. They were ordering these crimes to be done, and this was proven in the court of law, and they were sentenced. When there were no evidence for specific accusations, these men would be released, as they should be in any democracy and any judicial system that works. So it was really interesting to watch. It was really interesting to witness. And obviously, those trials were mostly done for these people, mostly women, who are the wives, the daughters, the sisters of the many, many people who disappeared. And you might have heard some of their names: Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, Hijos, Las Abuelas de la Plaza de Mayo, who are looking for their grandkids that were abducted and grew up with military families, oftentimes never telling them that they had been adopted or abducted, and forged papers to have them as like their natural children because they couldn't have some. And I'm just going to close with this image, which again is one of those that deconstructs the narrative. If you speak or if you listen to any of the men who participated, and I did speak to a couple, they always tell you two things. We were doing the right thing because there was a threat for the sovereignty of our country, and we were fighting a just cause, and I was only following orders. That's the official excuse that everybody will tell you. The problem is, if you know how to read body language, you know that if you have nothing to hide, you're not going to hide your face from a camera, right? And this is in Bahia Blanca. And I was invited by the judge to come in, as I mentioned. And as soon as I entered the courthouse, I had 17 men accused of crimes against humanity in front of me. And I raised my camera, and they all, not all, most of them start hiding their faces, which is very clear. Like, you have a lot to hide, otherwise you wouldn't be hiding your face from a camera. And so, funny enough, this image has been appropriated by several human rights groups in Argentina, and is now being used to show how ashamed they are of their own actions, which deconstructs the whole narrative that the extreme right has created for these men. So again, it's these ways that images are able to tell stories in ways that oftentimes text can, because you don't have that direct connection that goes on to your mind right away. That is one of the most powerful things about photographs, is that they trigger memories. Who here hasn't felt emotion when we see a photograph of our parents or great parents or any children or any dog? Like everybody, if I put a dog picture here, I know that half of you are just gonna say, oh. If I put a baby picture, that's a huge hit. And like, so these the powerful tools that photography have. They're able to trigger in all of us feelings. I could write a 500-page book about the story behind here, but in order to trigger you with those emotions, images are still one of the most, and still images in particular, are still one of the most interesting ways of communicating emotion and to trigger emotion. And I am very aware of that, and that's why I've been working with this and around this, and now also teaching around this, and hopefully other people will continue. But we're also in a time, and I'm just going to finish it there. We're in a time where many Operation Condors are or can start at any moment. As I started by saying, this was heavily sponsored by the United States. The CIA knew it, Henry Kissinger knew it. Everybody knew that Operation Condor was happening. It was all under classified information, which, by the way, is being declassified. Now the question is, what's ongoing now that we're not paying attention? What is within previous administrations that, as we know, or at least as I know, have been masters of major foreign policy fuck-ups. But we are entering a completely different era. And here we are today at Stanford, the mecca for technology, the mecca for tech bros. The tech bros are leaving from here, and now they're just like giving passes to the ongoing presidency. You are going to become eventually the next tech bros. What are you doing? What are we doing? What are we going to do in order to avoid surveillance, in order to avoid that our rights, and especially other people's rights who don't have our privilege, what are we doing to stop that? What are we doing to inform that? What are we doing to subvert the rules that are coming into place? That, and because theory is always about hypothesis, development, and conclusion, I'm not going to finish with the conclusion. I'm just going to finish with a question to you. What is your role? How are you going to engage with that? You're at Stanford. You're in one of the best schools in the world, I say. It's also your responsibility to think about these things. It's not only to sit here and to take notes and to ask interesting questions. It's like, what are you doing? That's my question for you. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, João. We're gonna open it for questions. And we'll start with our any students. So what people do in this one?
No question?
Ah.
I just had a question. From all the pictures that you took in your time there in South America, which one's your favorite and why is it your favorite?
My favorite pictures are always the one I was never able to make. For many reasons. But there's these moments that for one reason or another, either technical or ethical, or the situation, the security situation, it's not able to, it doesn't allow you to say, this is my moment. And those are the ones that stick in my mind. Of course, I can't do anything with them because I didn't make them. But those moments that I wasn't able to make that image are often the ones that I remember. The others, they're already out of my system because I was able to frame it, to put it into a photograph. But there isn't really, and of course there's a lot of, not too many, but some of my images that I like and I understand their importance But you being the person who makes those images, that relationship is very different from the ones we're seeing. And that's the hardest part as a photographer, is to be your own editor. In some cases, it's taken me years to understand the relevance of certain images that I've taken. And others, photo editors or people that I work with, they oftentimes are able to identify that right away. Like, no, this is great because of this and this. But because I was there, I'm like, yeah, but the situation was better than the image that I made. And I think I failed. And they're like, it's two different sciences. One thing is to do the image, another thing is to show or to engage with that. And editing is a very, very hard part. So the short answer is like, it's the images that I've never made. The long answer is I have a relationship to some images that I didn't really pay attention in my first edit, but over the years I have learned how to recognize that influence.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation. It's very useful to get another idea of how to present images and pictures. My question is about if you've been able to trace, like, for committing this kind of crimes, you need some kind of training and expertise. And I'm wondering if you've been able to trace some of the networks that the people committing these crimes, how do they perpetrated these networks in democracy, and some of the differences between the different countries that you've been taking pictures.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I didn't really focus much of my work on that, but there are some cases which is very clear. I'll give you an example. Is someone here from Brazil? Oh, a lot of people from Brazil. Great. We all remember Massacre de Candelaria, right? This was a police massacre
Yes.
in the late 80s, where policemen basically executed dozens of children, street kids who were sleeping, and they just went in and executed. The policemen who were involved in that specific massacre had all of them, all the masters, had been in the political police in Brazil. So the problem was those networks are in the system. That's why Josias, for example, is still living underground, because he knows those men are in the system. They were never trialed, never fired. They were just recycled and brought into democracy to do different things. In the case of the policemen, to do police work. In the case of military, some of them became presidents. So those networks are not as defined because they're dissolved inside of the states. There's obviously a lot of investigation that could be done in terms of how some of these people took huge advantage, economic advantage of their knowledge and their contacts. And this is across the board. If you go from Argentina to Bolivia to Uruguay, there's always someone who had very strong connections to the repression of the dictatorships in very high positions in economic terms. And then, of course, you cannot forget that a lot of these men, military men, were trained in the School of the Americas in Panama by the United States. So they also have connections here that would allow them to keep doing their thing more or less officially. So it is a very extensive network, which was not part of my work. I heard a lot of it. There's been stories, journalistic stories written about some of that, but I didn't. 10 years was enough for me to work on this. I'm like, I'm not going to open another Pandora's box in that sense, but it's certainly a very interesting question.
Not so much a question, but a comment, probably, especially for the younger students. Stanford has, Bolivar House has a hopeful connection to all of this. The former director of the Center for Latin American Studies, Jerry Carl, retired from political science, has been working pro bono to bring to justice a lot of this military that are lingering in the United States. And as she said once, sometimes you win some, sometimes you lose.
Mhm.
She lives in San Francisco and she's still doing it.
Yeah, there is a lot from the United States and other places and all of these countries, a lot of civil society effort and grassroots organizations really like doing very, very important work, not only in the judicial system, but also in memory, and memorializing and bringing in educational programs, etc. So it's yeah, if you're interested there, it's very easy to get involved and very easy to learn and to be able to like spot what is now going on in different places, right?
So you started the presentation talking about like phrasing it as a question I thought was really brilliant. It's like, how do you photograph something that's already happened, that was in the past? You gave us a wonderful answer and thank you for the presentation. Another way, another answer is you can dramatize it, right? You can fictionalize it, you can represent in other ways. So my two-part question. First is, have you seen the film I'm Still at Key? Do you have thoughts on it? And second, I wonder if you could maybe put your work or your approach in, how do you see it in relation to quote unquote more artistic approaches or fictionalized or dramatized approaches?
I think artistic and fiction, they're two very different things. I'll start by the second, and then I'll go into Still Key. I have thought about it quite extensively. And in this book's been published 10 years ago, 11 years ago. The book that I just published last year, which is about a former concentration camp in Cape Verde, where my grandfather was and where his parents went to visit twice, brought a camera and photographed all the living prisoners and all of the graves of the dead, made me question that, made me really ask myself that question. I never like to repeat myself. So instead of photographing in black and white square, I photographed in color. Instead of using text as like really like this brief things like I did in Condor, I decided to write much more extensively. But to me, it was very hard to think of myself as a writer. And the way I did approach this new project, which I also have the book here if you want to look at it afterwards, is that I decided to write letters for my grandfather and my great-grandfather, who I've never met. And I had this incredible archive of images that were produced there. I had the letters that they wrote to each other, and I decided to directly interfere in those correspondence and write replies. What I'm writing is not fiction, but it's obviously to a fictional character. So it's those things which in film you call doc fiction that I'm very interested, because it give you tools that obviously if you stick to facts, you cannot do. And that's where film is very important. The fact that you can reenact the whole thing. And in photography, there are people doing it too. But I particularly think that in film, that is a very, very interesting tool, and we can learn a lot from it. Is in any film, if it's based on true facts, the book is always better than the film. And this, Still Key, I'm still here. It's not any different. I've read the book and then I watched the movie, and I think the book is much better. But the film did something for me that the book didn't. The usage of photographs in the film is truly spectacular. Not only the still images that you see, but also how they're thinking. And this is part of the book as well. But the way Walter Salles did the script, if you've seen the movie, you've seen that scene where there's a press photographer there to portray the family with a missing father.
Yes.
And there's a key moment where he says, the photographer says, make a sad face. And she's like, why would we make a sad face? And she tells all the kids to smile. This is super interesting from a non-fictionalized perspective. Like, how do you decide, and which is obviously a very contemporary conversation about representation, right? How do you decide as a photographer to portray the other? And when it's portraits, you're clearly engaging with those people and you're directing them most of the times. And why do you say, or why do you trigger a certain emotion to capture? Because it's a better photograph. So the way Walter is able to bring that into the film, it's really, really incredible. So it's not only the still images, it's not only the photography of the film, which is obviously spectacular, but it's also the photographic thought that exists in the film that to me was really the takeaway of that film.
As a segue to that answer, I was wondering when your presentation, I have two questions. The first one, in your presentation, you have been talking about how your photography focuses on the survivors, the places, the narratives. I wonder if in the project you also involve the photographic history of these years, right? Like, because you've been talking about film photography, we know that, from the 60s and 70s, we have cinema novo, we have all of these, even when you were talking about Patricio Guzman, like the famous picture of the cameraman that is killed in Chile.
Mhm.
So, and the hope that photography can not only document reality, but also transform it.
Mhm.
And there are many photographers, I'm not going to mention them. I wonder how you engage with that history in your work or in this project in particular. And also because you started by saying that you wanted to dialogue with us about what you were going to show. I wonder if you can tell us about showing this same pictures to people in South America. What is the dynamics there? What do you learn from it?
Those are two very different. So I'll engage first with the first question. If you see the book starts with the archive. Starts with images that are not made by me.
Happy birthday.
Yeah. And that's actually the last part of the work as well. So I was discussing this with someone that I care deeply for, Elizabeth Biondi, which was the visual director of the New Yorker for a very long time. And if you read the New Yorker, you see there's not many photographs, but every single photograph that is there, it's very powerful. And Elizabeth and I, we were having a conversation, we're going over the contact sheets, we're going over years of work. And we started to think about conceptually about the work. So in my work, I was engaging with the present, and I was sort of representing the past through these silences, right? But I didn't have silence, the action of the past, because simply I wasn't born. And at the beginning, as I said, the history, when I started in 2007, all the way to 2005, all the way to 2014, it kept changing. And certain aspects of it, including archives, changed. So in 2012, when this conversation happened, when she mentioned that, it was very clear to me, like, oh, I can actually go back and I can go to some of the archives. And that happened. So I worked very, very close to some local photographers like Aurelio Gonzalez in Uruguay, Lucho in Santiago. There's an amazing documentary about Santiago and the photographers in Santiago those years called La Ciudad de los Fotógrafos. And then with public archives, La Vicaría de la Solidaridad, certain archives in Argentina, certain archives in Brazil. And my question is like, what do you have of photographs? And I kept going and kept going and kept going until I found things that I thought made sense to represent the past with the actions of the past. So I found quite a few interesting images. And then obviously with the right permissions from the photographers in the archives, I reproduced some of them in the book and a lot more in the exhibition. So to me, it was very important to bridge that and also not to appropriate that work. And in the book, there's a big effort to do that almost drove all my publishers insane. Because it's the type of thing that photographers do that nobody else notices. But if you look at the book, the first images, the ones in black and white, the ones in the archive, they're printed in a warm tone. And my images are printed in a cool tone. Because that was the boundary, that was the separation of what was mine, made by others. And these are only small details that only like bookmakers understand. But to me was incredible. And obviously at the end, I gave the credits to the photographer. but I wanted to visually separate and give the proper homage to those men, always men, who were there and who made those photographs. So that is to answer your question. And remind me of the second.
About showing
Oh, the engaging in South America. So I did this project not to be at Stanford talking about it. And I've so far been able to exhibit this in 5 of the 6 countries of operation. The first one was in Brazil in 2014. And then I went to Argentina, went to Chile, went to Paraguay, went to Uruguay. I'm still missing Bolivia. It was very interesting because everybody's wary of something. And so the museum was wary of some things. The archives were wary of other things. And there's a beautiful series that I use that I got from the archive of the secrets of the intelligence services of the Buenos Aires police that are from Brazilians who, after the coup in 73, they were exiled in Chile, and the coup happened, and they asked Argentina for political asylum. So they were all brought to Argentina and registered, full body, but like very different images from the mug shots that we normally see, like relaxed people, one guy smoking a cigarette, everybody sort of dressed up. And those were very like interesting images. And I decided to use them in the exhibition and to print them life size, so 6 feet high. So the entrance of the exhibition was a corridor of these men and women who had been bouncing around from one country to the other. And these images and detailed political information was kept in the archive of the intelligence services, meaning they were being followed while they were in Argentina. So everybody was like, oh, but the rights and these people and what happened and this and that. The day I opened the exhibition in São Paulo, these 22 people are there, the pictures, the representation of these 22 people. And several people come to see the show saying, I know this person. Here's the contact. I know that. He passed away a few years ago. I know the story. And I didn't know who they were. I only had access to the pictures. So they were able to identify them. And then I'll tell you, and because this is a literary world, I'll tell you an interesting story of that archive. There was an image of a man in that archive that was misplaced. And that man, of course, I'm blanking on their name, famous Chilean writer that taught at Duke. Thank you.
Wow.
One of those images was Ariel Dorf.
Oh, wow.
Wait. And I showed the mock-up of the book to a friend who's Chilean, and he's like, this guy's not Brazilian. This guy is Dorfman. I'm like, who's Dorfman? He's like, Ariel Dorfman. Pato Ronaldo. Ah, okay. So I did not include that image because it was non-Brazilian.
Yeah.
Fast forwarding 7 years from the book coming out, a friend of mine is doing an artistic project for Amnesty International regarding Operation Condor. And he tells me, well, I'm working with Ariel Dorfman. And I'm like, well, funny enough, I have an image from Dorfman. Can you put me in touch with it? And he did. So I wrote to Ariel and say, well, you don't know me, but actually I have this image and I wanted to give it back to you. Here it is. I sent him a scan and Dorfman writes back to me. This is in 2020. And he writes back to me saying, well, it comes in a very interesting time because I've never seen this image. But recently I've been writing about the moment where this photograph was taken. And the details that you give me that this image was in a folder called Brazilians explains why I survived. Because I went to Argentina where it was born. And the fact that I wasn't traced there was basically because there was a misplacement of his file. And he was able to escape Argentina and come to the US.
No way.
He was born in Argentina, lived in Chile,
and in the US, and so he's a dual
US,
citizen.
Came as a child. to the-
So it's fascinating how the archive and how these stories keep developing. The day that I opened the exhibition in Asunción in Paraguay, I'm there and we did a very cool installation in the Senate room where Stroessner used to speak to the senators. And I basically pasted all around it, like pasted images on those walls. And there's someone who comes in and like, oh, congratulations, I really like the work. I brought you something. And he just hands me copies of top secret documentation. And I'm like, fuck, I'm done with this. I can no longer work on Operation Condor. I'm done. And they're like, no, you should have it. And I'm like, and now I'm sitting on a stack of documents from the intelligence services from Paraguay. I'm like, it never ends. And this is the beauty of it too. It's like you start digging and certain people listen, and I could tell you 20 more stories like this. So it's super rewarding to be able to show the work, to engage in conversations, and to just let the work live for itself. The fact that the image has been appropriated and shown over and over again trials, like I'm super excited about it. So yeah, it's to trigger conversation. I try to do the work that I do, not to judge anyone, but mostly to create conversations. And that's what I hope to do.
So I have this privilege and rather sad pleasure of adjourning our meeting, which I'll start to do now very slowly. Thanking everyone for being here. I had a conversation with João yesterday over lunch, and one thing you said, João, that really stuck with me was, while folks were in their libraries doing their PhDs, I was out there, doing the kind of work that we have seen today. And I want that to sink in with everyone here for a moment. It's important. It's truly an insight. And also, I want to make room in this series. I am, as it were, setting precedent in light of your talk and your work, João, for the future, that at least once a quarter, we do invite indeed folks whose path as Latin Americanists perhaps does not entail a PhD. And we do this as a community, and people come up with practitioners and special guests for at least once a quarter to have this kind of engagement, which indeed is indispensable. I want to thank you, and before I make a couple of announcements, to give you a guest from a gift rather for our guests.
The coffee mug is the most American thing. Thank you, Hector. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. I would like to invite you all to join us on February 28th at 1:30 for a lecture entitled Justice and Resistance, Human Rights Violations Against Indigenous Peoples in Latin America, the case of Berta Cáceres, by none other than Rosana Adholz, the clinical professor of law and director of UC Berkeley's Human Rights Clinic. I would also like to use this opportunity to introduce our newest team member. If you could stand up, please. Samantha Cosentino.
You already, and I'll do the rest of you next week when I start.
As of Tuesday, I hear.
Yes.
So our new events and communications officer, please take a moment to say hello. Thank you very much to Elizabeth for organizing, and to Joaquin Emiliano, and again to you, João, and to everyone. Have a good afternoon.
¿Sobreviviste a la reunión? No,